and welcome to Once Upon a Town, the show where we delve deep into Franklin history. I'm Eamon McCarthy-Earls.
And I'm Joe Landry.
Joe, what will we be talking about today on Once Upon a Town?
Well, I thought today we would talk about the Chilson Block.
This is really interesting to me because the Chilson family, much like the Rays and the Thayers and so many other of the famous names of much older times in Franklin, they have a really great legacy in this town, particularly Stanley Chilson, whose films really bring to life much of the 20th century in Franklin.
That's right.
But tell me more about the Chilson Block. It's not one of the blocks of downtown that I'm very familiar with.
Right. In fact, they only called it the Chilson Block when it was first built, and maybe just a few years after that. But anyway, here's what the Chilson Block, where it was. And this is recognizable today because it's right at the end of Dean Avenue, and that building is still there. This particular building that we're looking at, believe it or not, was a 3-story building.
Wow.
And at some point, I'm thinking around the 1970s or so, they decided to remove the 2 top floors and put a roof on this. So this is really the original building from 1913. And we'll talk more about that and how it was constructed later on in the presentation.
Joe, do you have a sense of why they decided to take down those 2 upper floors in the 70s?
I really don't. I'm not sure who did it, but I think Dr. Harvey Snetsky, I think, had his practice in there. He was an eye doctor. And I believe for a time, John the Barber was in there, John Monteroni or Monterossi, I think his name was, Monterati. And he had a barber shop in there. And I think also Milford Daily News had a little office in there for a while. Today it's the Rockland Trust owns the building. But yeah, I'm not sure why they reduced it in height. I really don't know. Yeah. So as I do all my research, I look back at the Franklin Sentinels, and I was looking through the 1900 editions of the Franklin Sentinels, and I came across this article. And it talks about when James O. Chilson built the first building at that location. He did that in 1870. And the lower floor was occupied by Mr. C, as the article says, as a meat and provision market. The second floor contained several rooms used for businesses and other purposes. And he conducted business there for about 22 years. Now, if it was built in 1870, that takes you up to about 1892. And it was around that time that I think the Chilson Market moved over to Depot Street, and that's when his nephew, Austin Chilson, started his market over on Depot Street. Austin Chilson was the father of Stanley Chilson. So there's a connection there. So this James O. Chilson was Stanley Chilson's great uncle. So, now, just to give you a little background, there's a lot of members of the Chilson family that had some prominence in Franklin, and I wanted to really understand the relationships between all these people in the Chilson family. And Austin Burnside Chilson, that's Austin B. Chilson, that was Stanley's father. Stanley also had a sister. Her name was Grace Louise Buchanan. And she was a fairly well-known woman around town. But you see, James Olney Chilson, he had a brother, Orrin Chilson, and Orrin was the father of Austin Chilson, so you can see the connection there. Now then, James O. Chilson had 2 sons, James Carlton and Dean Leroy. Now, James Carlton had a son, James Walter. That would be J. Walter Chilson, and if that name sounds familiar, it's because the beach down on Beaver Street is named after J. Walter Chilson, so I'm pretty sure that's him. And his wife was Marion Chilson, another woman that was well known around town.
And it seems like the family really had a pretty long run in Franklin, at least under the more or less direct Chilson name, 1754
absolutely.
To 1992, basically.
Right. Now, John Chilson was, I guess, the patriarch of the family. He was born in 1754. And this is not a total list of all the Chilson members. I chose just the ones that are more familiar, but there were many, many others too. I just chose these because of their prominence. And then Dean Leroy Chilson, he was a civil engineer in Franklin, and he was responsible for creating a lot of charts and maps and things, and we'll be talking about that later. And we've talked about him in other programs as well. He did a chart that showed the renumbering system in Franklin, and he was also involved in the design of a lot of the buildings too. So, but he was a civil engineer. Now the Chilson Block, as I said, was located right at the end of Dean Avenue on Main Street. This particular picture is from the 1888 map of Franklin, and it shows the Chilson Block there. And then on this picture, you can see the Fletcher Block, which is on the right, and we're looking towards the town bridge, and the arrow points to the Chilson Block as it looked like before around 1900. And I say 1900, it's before 1907, because we can see just to the left of the Chilson Block, we can see the Hotel Darling. Actually, it was called the Hotel Windsor at that time. That was demolished in 1907. So we know this picture was taken before 1907.
And it's very interesting in this picture. I noticed the two buggies, or it's a little hard to tell if they're buggies or actually even very, very early cars. I don't see any sort of tiller or steering wheel to run those, but if the picture cuts off, just sort of being able to see if there's anything to hitch horses up to those. But that's a fascinating glimpse of Franklin in the early 1900s.
I would say those are, they call them horseless carriages, and I believe that's there is a handle there. We probably don't see it, but I'm pretty sure that's motorized. I don't think that's horse-driven. I don't believe. And then this picture dates between 1907 and 1913. And I know this because we now see the Felix Cataldo building to the left of that, and that was built in 1907. And the Chilson Block was demolished in 1913. So that dates this picture between 1907 and 1913.
And you mentioned earlier that there at one point was a Milford Daily News annex within this building.
Correct.
Would that have already been in place there at that point in time, or was that really only after the Sentinel went out of business in the 1970s?
Well, the Sentinel ended in 1978. It's possible, and I don't know this for a fact, but I think the Milford Daily News then took over the Franklin News, and I believe probably at that point that's when they moved in there. Yeah. So now here's a picture that I just got recently, a couple of weeks ago. This is the Chilson Block, looking at it straight on, and you can tell this picture was taken when the building was fairly new. I'm guessing it's around in the late 1880s, which would mean this building is only like 15 years old or so.
And wood siding too, which is interesting given that it's currently brick.
Right. Well, we'll talk about that. But in roughly 1880 or so, we see Chilson's Market. Yeah, he sold provisions, as they called it. And then here's another picture. This was taken later. And I was looking at both of these pictures, and let me go back to the one previous for a second. You can see on the front extension of the building, you can see that nice railing up on the top. In the later picture, you don't see that railing anymore. So for some reason, they got rid of it. So my guess is this picture was taken, well, certainly before 1913. I'm guessing later in the late 1880s, but maybe 1890s.
And would this be any of the Chilson men themselves right here in this picture?
Probably. Probably one of them is James O. Chilson. I don't know that for a fact, though. Now, we talked about, well, actually, this is the Sanborn fire insurance map that I love to look at. And we can see the Chilson Block as shown there. There's groceries on the first floor and a dwelling on the second floor. So apparently they had apartments upstairs at that
And a little
time.
wagon shed in the back for
And a wagon shed in the back and a livery stable. The building with the X means livery stable. So, yep. And to the right of it, actually, well, in this view, you can see the J.P. Ray's building. That was the Hotel Windsor building. It was owned by the Ray family, Joseph P. Ray. And we talked about that in, well, actually, we will be talking about that in the Felix Cataldo Block presentation, which we'll do in another program. Now, from the 1884 Franklin Business Resident Book, we see that Chilson and Richardson had their store in the Chilson Block. It's on Main Street. Chilson also had a partner, Razzie, and they had, I think it was an express where they would go into Boston. They would leave Franklin at 10 a.m., leave Boston at 3:30. So they had like an express run going in back and forth between Boston. And this was from the 1890 Sentinel.
Was your sense that was sort of an express order service where they could have fast pickup, almost like an overnight FedEx today or something like that?
I think so, yeah. We see some of the older pictures of that block, and you can see the sign out front that says Razzie and Chilson. So, yeah. and apparently, now 1893, this kind of aligns with what I just said about the Chilsons moving their store over to Depot Street. It looks like Richardson possibly stayed in that location and joined up with Emerson. That's just a guess, but it kind of makes sense, I think.
And I think this is just such an interesting advertisement because it tells you how the American diet has shifted since the early 1900s.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
Americans have more or less stopped eating mutton, more or less stopped eating lamb,
Yeah.
and definitely stopped eating tripe. So, all classics of British cooking that didn't make the
Absolutely.
cut 100 years later.
That's right. But I love these old the Franklin business directories, the advertisements and the addresses of the businesses. It just gives you a lot of good information. Another one that was in the Chilson Block, 44 Main Street, by the way, was the address for the Chilson Block, and it actually continues to be that address to this day. Zunio and Grigori had a fruit and confectionery store there. They also had one in Milford, too, apparently, but they also had one in the Chilson Block. This is from 1905. And then, as I said, in the back, they had the stable. A gentleman by the name of Horace Wells ran it in 1909. And then, in 1913, Dean Chilson, we talked about Dean, his father was James O. Chilson, the owner of the block. He had a company called Franklin Construction Company, and I've seen that name pop up quite a bit in my research. They did all kinds of work, and as I mentioned, Dean was an engineer, a civil engineer. In fact, it mentions Luigi Yadicinia. He was involved with the building of the arch in front of Alpi Way at Dean Academy. And my great uncle George was actually involved in that as well.
Really nothing that they can't do. Sewage, roadwork, factories, public buildings, foundations,
absolutely.
Everything.
Absolutely. Now, in 1912, the story that I read in the June 7th edition says, it leaked out yesterday that the post office is going to move to the Chilson building. The post office was previously, well, at the time, the post office was in the Ray building, which was in that building on Main Street between Depot Street and Dean Avenue. Previously, it had been in the Exchange building. Previous to that, it had been on West Central Street. But the word was that they were going to move the post office into the Chilson building. And so the plan was they were going to sign a lease for a term of years, understood to be 10. And what they were going to do is they were going to reconstruct the building slightly. And we'll talk about what their plan was. But first, here's the article that I read in the same paper. It may be of interest to refer to the fact that the post office had been in its present location, the Ray building, for the past 40 years, having been removed from the Russicue building, where George Peck's store is now located. That would be the Exchange building on the bridge. And talks about the other postmasters that were there. But here's where they talk about how they were going to redo the Chilson building, the Chilson Block. So what they were going to do, they were going to face the building with concrete, similar to the new YMCA building. Now that caught my eye because the YMCA building was the Masonic Temple, the Masonic Hall, right behind the post office.
Now, was that built that way originally, or was it something where the Masons acquired that building from the YMCA eventually?
Yes, it was built originally as the YMCA, complete with the bowling alleys and all that. And they refaced that building with the cement, probably called stucco today, originally. And then in 1938, 39, the Masons bought the building and took it over at that time.
And I think it's probably worth mentioning in the case of the Masonic Temple for any of our watchers who are new to town that is currently the parking lot at the very back of the post office.
Right.
It burnt down in 2011, pretty much completely to the ground.
Oh, it was a bad fire. Yeah. It's a shame, too. It was carelessness that caused the fire. As unfortunately, a lot of the fires that we see in Franklin, carelessness causes them, and we lose a nice building. But, yeah. So the Chilson Block was going to have the post office in it, and the second floor was going to have some businesses up there, and the third hall, they were going to add a third story to that building. And they were going to have a hall up there, and some of the organizations in town were thinking of taking over that hall. So the remodeled building would be very attractive in appearance, entirely different from the present building. And then in August 2nd, Dean L. Chilson and Company, Franklin engineers, they have begun the reconstruction of the new Chilson Block. So they're going to start redoing it. Now, there was one business in there had just formed. It was A. Simon & Sons, the furniture company. They formed in 1912. And according to my research, I think they're probably, you can point to them as being the oldest business in Franklin.
That's still operating today.
They're still operating today, right. So here's an announcement that Simons had put. We wish to announce to our friends and patrons we have removed from our furniture store from 44 Main Street. They temporarily moved into the Metcalf block just down the street, up in the music hall, up on the second floor. They eventually moved across the street into one of the Russicue buildings, and they were there until in the 30s when they moved to East Central Street. So that was one business that moved out of there. And that Zuni and Grigori also moved out of there as well. We're going to talk about that here. So the work of changing over the Chilson building will begin at once on August 20th. As Mariani Grigori, the well-known fruit dealer, he vacated the premises. And so everybody's out of there now. But 2 days later, James O. Chilson has now decided, instead of remodeling the building, he said, let's just tear it down. Let's just start from scratch. And so he's going to put up a nice new building, a 3-story brick building. And that's why we have a brick building there now.
I see. So they actually, in 1912, tore down the wooden building we've been seeing with their provisions store and really replaced it with that brick building it stands today.
Exactly. So they decided to just tear it down, start from scratch. And maybe that was probably a good decision. But so here's an article that talks about the new building. This is in December now. The lower floor of the new post office building is being pushed rapidly so that Postmaster Sherman can get into his new quarters. And it talks about the walls are going to be with metal sheathing, etc. Some of the walls in the second and third floor will be covered with pressed board, etc. The Oddfellows Hall was going to be up on the third floor, etc. So the building will be an added adornment to the business structure of the street. So
and good and fireproof too, by the sound of things, with pressed board walls, metal sheathing, all that stuff.
That's right.
Probably a big concern with the older building would have been fire safety.
Right. Now here's a picture that I was able to get, and I'm guessing I call it circa 1913. Pretty close to it, I think. And you can see the newly constructed Chilson Block, and next to the Fletcher Block. And then this is the 1913 renumbering map that Dean Chilson did. It talks about how they renumbered the things, the streets and the businesses. As you can see, 44 Main Street was that building. And then to the right of it is the Fletcher Block and the numbering system for those. And here's a picture of the building when they had the post office in the first floor. And that's probably,
maybe 1920s, some point like that?
Yeah, probably 1920s.
I think it was 1934 that they relocated across the street to the current post office.
Exactly.
As part of the Work Projects Administration.
That's right.
Sort of job creation during the Great Depression.
Exactly, yeah. And then behind that block, in January of 1913, a gentleman by the name of Charlie Lawrence, who owned the diner at the time, the Main Street Diner, although he called it the Franklin Diner, Charlie Lawrence decided to contract with the Franklin Construction Company to build a bowling alley in the rear of that post office building. There was a bowling alley back there. Yeah. And then, not 3 months later, his bowling alley and pool room in the rear are already open. I mean, I can't believe how fast they would build buildings back then.
Probably no building permits.
Well, I don't know about that, but and so then now we go to 1920, where Harry Haywood, he was the gentleman that owned Haywood Mills, which is today's mill store, Franklin Mill Store, but he purchased the Chilson Block, and on which the first floor is the post office, and offices up on the second floor and a hall on the third floor. And with some contemplated alterations, the second floor could be made into an ideal club room, and the third floor would be for meetings and organizations. He didn't want to do anything with the post office. It will remain as it is. And so in this plan, Mr. Haywood has the hearty cooperation of Mrs. Haywood. So
always good to have that.
Oh, you got to have that. So, but in 1930, Harry Haywood died. And so the family decided to auction off both the Chilson Block, now it's his Haywood, we can't really call it the Chilson Block anymore. They auctioned it off, and as well as they also put his house up for auction. Well, the house apparently didn't sell, but this building did sell. And Jacob Gebb, he purchased it.
And I would draw our viewers' attention to the sign hanging above the door that says this block sold at public auction, as well as the Model A.
That's right.
In the lower right-hand side of the picture.
Right. Yeah, so it was September 17th of 1931. Yep. And again, post office, I'm sure, stayed there until, like you said, 1934, 35, when they built the new post office. And then the bowling alley had some damage done in 1939. Fire that caused an estimated damage of $6,000. And apparently they're calling it Unk's Bowling Alley at the time. Don't know who Unk was, but it was in the rear of Davis Department Store. We're going to see in a minute that when the post office did move out, Harry Davis, who owned a department store, actually was down in the Morse block at the time, he moved into where the post office was, and that's where you'll see Davis Department Store. And we'll see a picture of that in a minute. And here's a statement of policy. Unfortunately, Harry Davis died in 1941. The family of the late Harry Davis wishes to thank their many friends whose kindnesses have helped during the past week. The store will continue to operate with Evelyn Davis in charge, and she'll maintain the same high standards that Harry did. But because of the legal problem of settling an estate, business will have to be on a cash basis for a time. So we should be very grateful to all who would help us settle affairs by paying their accounts promptly.
And I would also just note that this is pre-credit cards. This is
Right.
prior to the rollout of credit cards around 1960 or 65, with early ones like Visa and stuff like that.
That's right.
So this is really just store credit, where people would essentially be getting an IOU from the store itself.
Well, like people like Freddie Saltman that had Franklin Furniture, it was very fashionable for him to extend credit to people, and everybody honored that. They made the payments and everything. And the other thing, J.J. Newberry, he ran his store on a cash basis, thinking that he would save the customers money by lowering the prices, because he didn't have to worry about people not paying their bills and going after them for credit and everything. So he maintained a cash basis. So, yeah. And then here's the Davis Department Store in that location. This was taken around 1944. And then in 1949, the Davis Department Store closed its business on Main Street, and the late Harry Davis was the original owner, but Millis parties have run the business recently, so they were running it. So, and then in later years, and this is what I remember, Thunderbird Cleaners. A gentleman by the name of Charlie Hooper was one of the people. I think he was probably the only person that ran it. But one popular trivia question that I like to ask people: what did E&W stand for? E&W Laundry. Well, apparently there was a competitor in town, E&W Laundry, and I think they merged to create Thunderbird Cleaners. And E&W, they were owned. The company, that business was owned by two gentlemen, Charles Erlinson and Guy Woodworth. Erlinson and Woodworth, E&W. So.
I also note the DuPont process signs that
right.
they have advertising their latest chemicals from DuPont Chemical.
That's right. Yep. And then there were different businesses and things that were up in that building. I saw this one in the 1950 edition of the Sentinel. Steve Barnard's School of Dance. They taught tap, ballet up there. So there was that, 44 Main Street. And then a modern school of music at 44 Main Street. Instructions in guitar, banjo. And as we know today, the Franklin School for the Performing Arts is right next door. So a lot of musical schools and things downtown. Now, we talked about the Ray Block over on Main Street, across the street from the Chilson Block. And in 1970, they demolished that building. And that building originally, in 1959, the Elks were formed, and that was their first home. But in 1970, the Elks had to find a new home. And so temporarily, they moved into 44 Main Street. And this article talks about the Franklin Elks may be without a home for the next 2 weeks unless they obtain an extension of a notice to evacuate the present quarters in the Faber building. That's what they were calling it back then. They were talking about transferring their liquor license over to 44 Main Street, which is where Thunderbird Cleaners was. And a spokesman for a number of Elks who were present for the hearing said the club had been given till midnight on Tuesday to leave the Faber building, which reportedly had been purchased by Dean College. The building was going to be demolished.
That's interesting that it was briefly known as that the Ray Block, sort of diagonally across the street where Dean Bank is located today, was known, at least at the time of this, for a brief period, as the Faber Building.
I know it, yeah.
And also interesting that Dean Junior College bought it. I guess they must have just given up on it eventually and sold the vacant lot to Dean Bank.
Well, because from what my understanding was they tore it down in 1970, but they didn't really, Dean Bank didn't really build anything there until, I think, in the 80s. So it was there for quite a while as an empty lot. I know in the 1978, during the 1978 parade, I've seen footage where you can see the block still empty there. So it was stayed empty until Dean bought it, and I'm not sure exactly what year they bought it, but so yeah. So that's really the end of the discussion on the Chilson Block.
Thanks for joining us. Until next time, I'm Eamon McCarthy-Earls.
And I'm Joe Landry.
See you soon.
This program was made possible by your Franklin friends and neighbors, good folks just like you. Thanks for supporting Franklin TV. And thanks for watching.